All right, well, hello, week 5 already. Today, we're just going to have one video lecture. It's going to be about the same length as the others, but I'm going to focus on Andrew Jackson and the nullification controversy will be the end. Now, last week we discussed the American system of manufacturing, the era of good feelings, and the attempts at creating true American self-sufficiency. These are themes in this week's recordings as well. I was a little ahead of the game on some of this, so if necessary, please go watch or rewatch those from last week. The links are still available in the announcements section. Now, within this larger context of nationalism, regionalism, and a growing republic, one of the most democratic leaders of our nation's history, let me go back, within this larger context of nationalism, the nationalism that emanates from the victory of the War of 1812. I probably should have had a video lecture on that because I think the War of 1812 has a lot more importance symbolically, especially than people give it credit for. It was not a true victory. It was not anything we were prepared to do, but a lot came out of it. And one of these things, again, is nationalism, this sense of pride. So within this larger context of nationalism, of the regionalism that is part of the greater whole that was the American system, of the growing republic, remember we're just in the first few decades of our nation's history, one of the most democratic leaders of our nation's history, well, theoretically, he was democratic, would come to power. His name, King Andrew, Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. Now, King Andrew, as he was called this. He held great power, partially due to his military exploits in the War of 1812, invasion of Spanish Florida, partially due to the personal influence that he wielded. He was truly a force of politics in the young nation, and he would not be stopped. To be sure, the American system and the attempt at neo-federalism did not appeal to everyone. A new political party began to form under the tutelage of Martin Van Buren, John Calhoun, and Thomas Hart Benton. And this was called the Democratic Party. They did not favor the National Republican platform, again, the national system, the American system, but called for a return to Jeffersonian simplicity, states' rights, and Republican principles. Still kind of sounds like Jefferson's party, right? This is one example of how political parties in their very core can change so much over time, because again, you look at some of these, the focus on rural America, states' rights, Republican principles, those were originally part of the Democratic Republican Party. Now, Jackson was portrayed as the common man. Supporters emphasized that he grew up with nothing but hardship, that he was born in a log cabin under rustic circumstances. His two brothers and mother died in the Revolutionary War, and at the age of 13, Jackson joined a mounted militia company and was captured by the British, who beat him mercilessly. He would become a senator and a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court, and of course there were those military accomplishments. Pardon me. But Jackson represented the classic rags to riches story. A man born with nothing who grew into greatness, and the people ate it up. He won the presidency in 1828, and 10,000 visitors crammed into the Capitol to witness his inauguration. After taking the oath of office, he showed his usual disdain for tradition and pushed through the crowd and mounted his horse, galloping off to the White House. A mob followed him, entered the presidential mansion, where a party broke out. Jackson was forced to flee the near riot by climbing out a back window and getting assistance and escaping from a party that was held in his honor. He was immensely popular, and in many ways he would change the office of the presidency. Previously, the office was filled by men of genteel nature, who had been born into wealth, who acted as gentlemen. Jackson was different. He acted as himself. He was brash. His actions often demonstrated he was not one of gentility or aristocracy. And this plays again in part of this idea that he was a very democratic person. Now, King Andrew's presidency would reflect this more democratic nature. Many believed D.C. was rife with conspiracy and inbreeding, so Jackson promised retrenchment and reform in the federal system. He challenged the notion that government work required an elite corps of professional civil servants, declaring such duties were, quote, so plain and simple that men of intelligence may readily qualify themselves for their performance. He wanted to prevent anyone from being entrenched in government positions, so he mandated a regular rotation of office, so that no one was allowed to remain for over 4 years. Now, these were appointments, not congresspeople, of course. After that, civil servants would have to return to, quote, making a living as other people do. Interesting ideas, of course. They sound great. And And again, this kind of flies in the face, especially with later American history, with the progressives, with Kennedy, with Obama. They focus so much on these experts, professional experts. And again, Jackson said, no, it's not necessary. People can be civil servants and not be these professionals, these elite people. The average person can do it with any modicum of intelligence. So again, he tries to clear out corruption. He focuses on retrenchment, reform. Yet the antipathy Jackson showed for the Democratic Republican appointments and the patronage behind them extended to him. He often selected cabinet members or other appointments based mainly on loyalty to him. So he was really no better than the corruption he was trying to clear up. He called the shots too, rarely seeking cabinet members' advice on key issues. Similarly, he demonstrated his unease with the idea of balance of power between the three branches of government. Sound familiar? Claiming that since he was the only political official elected by all the people, he would not hesitate to stand in opposition to any opponent. He vetoed more bills than all of his predecessors combined, showing his distaste for the legislative branch, and readily stood up to the judiciary whenever he believed it was incorrect about something. Thus, we have the name, again, King Andrew, because he believed he was the almighty ruler of the nation. Now, let's talk about the West, the public domain, what's going on there. This is all part of Jackson's presidency, of course, because for Jackson, the issue about the West, the issue about the public domain, was also about politics and, again, currying favor with voters. He acted very democratic, acted very pure, but in many ways, again, he just emulated everybody else. A bill calling for federal money, that's one example, to build a road in Kentucky. Now, this is part of the overall infrastructure. This is part of this change that we see in America, trying to connect the country. So this bill calls for federal money to build a road in Kentucky, but it's vetoed, primarily because it went against the wishes of Jackson's supporters in New York, and because it would have benefited his rival, Henry Clay. With regard to the public domain, Jackson's predecessors had sold land to profit the government. Jackson would reverse course on this. He argued that small farmers should be able to buy federal land for no more than the cost the government to survey the plot and process the sale. That does sound pretty democratic, doesn't it? Seizing the moment, Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri proposed that the price of government land be dropped gradually from $1.25 to 25 cents an acre, and that any lands sold so that any lands not sold should be given away. Furthermore, squatters were given first right to purchase land when the government offered it for sale. Sounds good. Well, for the farmer anyway. Eastern and Southern folks worried this would tip the balance of power in Congress to the West if there was too much migration, and that such migration would limit the labor pool and thus drive up the price of labor in their areas. Folks also worried as to how the government would make up for the money it lost from these sales. For example, would they have to institute new tariffs? So again, he curries favor with those who support him and antagonizes those who do not. Let's talk a little bit about his Native American problem. Now, when we see a Native American problem, of course, it sounds like they were the problem. No. Sorry, a little scratchy throat right now. The 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast had essentially adopted Jefferson's ideal of acculturation, yet some still wanted them out of the way. Some farmers coveted their land for cotton fields, but they were mainly seen as an impediment toward westward migration. The government tried to convince these tribes along the frontier to move further west, but for the most part they did not. Whereas previous administrations had at least paid lip service to honest dealings with the natives, Jackson did not. Now, again, it's important to recognize here that there were actual reasons people wanted Native Americans out of the Southeast. Racism, of course, would be part of it. Some people just didn't like them, hated them. But there are these things. Again, farmers want this land, and for the government, they think westward migration will be facilitated if these Native Americans would move. So let's go back a little bit in Jackson's history. In 1817, there was this issue, and he tells President Monroe, quote, "I have long viewed treaties with the Indians an absurdity not to be reconciled to the principles of our government." As president, he would act upon this. He wanted to remove all Eastern Indians to the west side of the Mississippi by force if necessary. His Indian Removal Act of 1830 facilitated this, appropriating the funds necessary to purchase all of the lands held by Indian tribes east of the Mississippi and to pay for their resettlement in the west. In 1831, when farmers penetrated Sauk Indian Territory, the Jackson administration authorized federal troops to forcibly move the entire band of more than 1,000 across the Mississippi. In 1831, from 31 to 32, the Choctaws in Mississippi and Alabama became the first tribe to be forcibly removed from their lands to a designated Indian territory in Oklahoma. They were joined by the Creeks in 1836 and the Chickasaws in 1837. Cherokees in Georgia acculturated to the point that they adopted a constitution based on the United States. But it was nullified. From this point on, Georgia would do all it could to push Cherokees out of the state, strong-arming missionaries and extending authority over Cherokee Nation, even though they had a treaty with the United States which established them as a sovereign nation. The Treaty of New Echota in 1835 would finalize things as a minority group within the Cherokees were able to sell the last 8 million acres of Cherokee land in the east to the government for only $5 million. In 1838, federal troops rounded up the entire Cherokee tribe and force marched them to Indian Territory. This would be, of course, the Trail of Tears. Seminoles in Florida would resist militarily, and even though by 1842 many of them had willingly relocated, some would remain in the Florida swamps, the U.S. withdrawing troops after losing 1,500 men during the 10-year conflict with the Seminoles. So at least one group was able to stand their ground. So we see here again Jackson, his kind of his faux democracy, calls it corruption, but then he kind of perpetuates those actions. We see the way he treats Native Americans. Again, total disdain, not even, as I mentioned, not even paying lip service to the idea that he would follow them. Now we're going to get to one more thing here that focuses on the sectionalism of the time. And really the nature of Jackson's presidential leadership. And all this is really best reflected in the Nullification crisis, which pitted the South versus the North, rural America versus urban America, agriculture versus finance and commerce, and the bottom line, states' rights versus federal control. Nullification crisis occurred between 1832 and 1833. Now, what is nullification? Nullification essentially allows for a state review of a federal law. If the state considers a federal law unconstitutional, it can declare it void or nullify it. This brings up the big question, who has the authority, the federal government or the individual states, who are quote-unquote contracting entities? Nationalists argued that the Supreme Court was the final arbiter of what is and is not constitutional. Nullifiers felt that the states should decide this. One of the big issues that we see, this is kind of what everything emanates from, is the tariff. That is the protectionism that the government provided business, particularly those in the Northeast, and that is why the South are unhappy. Now, let's go back a little bit to the groundwork of this nullification idea, because it's something that's been brought up in the recent past, and it is something that actually has a foundation with our founding fathers. In the 1790s, in Kentucky, in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, Jefferson and Madison argued that states should be able to declare void any federal law which oversteps the federal government's legal authority. So basically, this goes back again to the origins of our nation, of the Republic, and the idea that states should have rights. And that the states, if not an equal power with the federal government, some thought the states should have more power than the federal government. Of course, we see the failed Articles of Confederation, which followed this, and then the new Constitution, which kind of balanced things out a little bit more. But again, folks like Jefferson and Madison, the Democratic Republicans, or anti-federalists, if you will, they want to hold on to states' rights. And so, again, they kind of put this idea of nullification in these resolutions. Now, the tariff. 1828. The Tariff of Abominations is what it was called. This was a tariff on foreign manufacturers, again, to protect northern business, and it would raise the price of goods sold in the U.S. There was another tariff in 1832. It was lower, but it was still too high for the South. Now, South, and particularly South Carolina, could not afford these goods and could not produce them on their own. What did they do? They threatened seceding from the national federal government. John Calhoun promoted nullification as an alternative in his, quote, exposition and protest. In this speech, he argued the state could nullify a federal law unless 3/4 of the states passed the law as a constitutional amendment. South Carolina would pass its nullification ordinance in 1832. In November at the state convention, an organized state military actually was there to defend the Capitol in the event of the federal government trying to collect money. And again, at this convention, they threatened secession if the federal government tried to use force, or if they enforced nullification, and they planned to enforce nullification beginning February 1st, 1833. Jackson considered this treasonous. Now, there's a few things to consider here. One is his distaste for Calhoun. One, again, is his belief that he is the almighty power, and you have a state here that is saying, we're not even going to follow this law that you have put in place. So he considers this treason. In 1833, Congress would pass what was called the Force Bill. What did the Force Bill do? It authorized Jackson to use violence to preserve the Union. Think about that. In 1833, Henry Clay would work out a compromise which would allow a reduction of rates to the 1816 level by 1842. This would be called the Compromise Tariff of 1833. Nullification then would be repealed by South Carolina, but they did nullify the Force Bill, which is pretty fun. Now, Henry Clay, major statesman in the 20th century, or in the 19th century, he was known as the Great Compromiser. Of course, we talked about him a little bit last week. He would be key to many of the compromises we see that will lead up to the Civil War. So his name will come up again and again and again. Now, let's go back a little bit here even. There is cheap land in the West, and this leads to a desire for a partnership between the West and the South versus the Northeast. This is what leads to the Webster-Hayne debates. In 1830, again going back a little bit, the South had attempted to partner with the West. Southern states would communicate with Western states and told them they would support free land in the public domain if the West supported repeal of the tariff. Webster, who was a Massachusetts senator, argued for nationalist government position. Hayne for the West and the South. Webster argued liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Jackson, in the meantime, during this era, was visited by somebody from South Carolina at the White House. And to this visitor, he would say, quote, "Please give my compliments to my friends in your state and say to them that if a single drop of blood shall be shed there in opposition to the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man I can lay my hand on engaged in such treasonable conduct upon the first tree I can reach." Imagine a president saying such a thing. Now, we currently have a president who says some kind of strange things, right? Nothing like this. And knowing that you have a president threatening people from one state with bodily violence is a little disconcerting. Now, at the end of 32, December 10th, Jackson would have his proclamation to the people of South Carolina in his attempt to resolve this. His quote, "I consider then the power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state, incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle on which it was founded, and destructive of the great object for which it was formed." He called the position of the nullifiers, quote, "impractical absurdity." So here we have Jackson, again, making these threats. Now, what he's saying here makes sense, because what was the Constitution? It was an attempt to form a union. Rather than having a collection of states, we wanted one nation. And what was part of that was the executive branch, and people like Jackson as president. So, I mean, he's not completely off here. But again, this proclamation, the verbiage that he uses, he's a little bit nasty. One historian, Avery Craven, would call this a, quote, local South Carolina affair. I would disagree. This was a major national affair or a regional affair, sectional. It involved sectionalism within the federal government. And you see, again, this disdain between the South and the North. And this is something, the Civil War is about slavery. But there are other issues that divide the South from the North. And this is one thing you have to take into account. The tariff, protectionism, this works to the benefit of New England merchants. It does not work for Southern farmers. Now, early on, South Carolina would stand alone in this early battle for states' rights. Those representing the state knew it was not appropriate at that time to debate slavery on moral grounds due to recent insurrections. But this was a way to discuss states' rights in a legal way. Others in the South were not happy with the tariff or protectionism, but South Carolina was the only state that was willing to do anything about it. Remember that, because South Carolina is always on the cutting edge. And of course, when we get to secession, they will be the first state to secede, and they will actually do their best then to bring in other states into the Confederate fold. The States' Rights and Free Trade Association would be formed in 1831 Charleston. It included all segments of the white population. And again, this goes to perpetuate these ideas of states' rights and free trade. Now, Representative and noted fire eater Robert Barnwell Rhett in 1828 would have this to say in the middle of the uprising. And the reason this is kind of out of chronological order, some of this kind of makes sense maybe. The key is you have the Tariff of Abominations, you have Clay's Compromise, but in the middle you have all these other things going on. And again, these kind of lay the groundwork, or at least a foundation, for some of the conflict we'll see later in the century. So I want to quote Robert Barnwell Rhett. Again, he is a noted fire eater, a supporter of slavery. He's South Carolinian through and through. And a great speaker, was known to really fire people up. And this part from the speech, I believe, is very moving. But if you are doubtful of yourselves, if you are not prepared to follow up your principles wherever they may lead to their very last consequence, if you love life better than honor, prefer ease to perilous liberty and glory, awake not, stir not. Impotent resistance will add vengeance to your ruin. Live in smiling peace with your insatiable oppressors, and die with the noble consolation that your submissive patience will survive triumphant your beggary and despair. Those are some words right there. That's quite and the entire speech is, again, it's very moving. But if you listen to little bits of it, if you love life better than honor. Now, the South, for all the things that we could say about them, honor was at the top of the hierarchy of what they deemed important. And what he is saying here, if you do not believe in your principles, if you think that honor is not important, if you're more worried about just getting by daily and having an easy life, then hey, don't worry about it. Let the North tell you what to do. But if you do believe in your principles and you do want to stand by your honor, you will stand up to the northern states, you will stand up to the federal government and stick up for what you believe is right. Again, interesting stuff. A lot of his ideas I do not agree with, obviously, but he was an impressive speaker. Never heard him speak, of course, but I've read his speeches in incredible language. So that's the nullification controversy. Again, you see how it lays this foundation for later splits within the country. You can see how this brings up the idea of states' rights versus the powerful federal government. You see the irony, if you will, or the hypocrisy of Andrew Jackson, who trumpets states' rights, regional power, but then what does he do? He uses the federal government to silence any dissent. Now, one last thing, let's kind of conclude with Jackson. And I ask, why was Andrew Jackson so popular? And to follow that up, was he truly a man of the people? What was his legacy? Indeed, he was a man of many contradictions. He was considered a man of the people, but he enjoyed alliances with business interests. He worked as a land speculator. He owned a stock of slaves. He was considered a political outsider, but his connections were strong and deep. For example, Martin Van Buren, he chose Van Buren himself to follow him as president, and Van Buren would win the election quite easily because Jackson chose him. He wanted to root out patronage via retrenchment, but made sure to promote and appoint those who were loyal to him first and foremost. And again, states' rights versus federal power, the bank versus nullification. He favored gold and silver over paper money. But who has gold and silver? The common man? Of course not. The wealthy people did. Yet somehow he's viewed as a champion of the common man. I know recently Time magazine put something out, the populist president or something, and I looked at it a little bit, and all I could do was shake my head, because many people, kind of the popular view of history is that Jackson was a man of the people. I'll let you decide. You've listened to this lecture, you've read about him, and again, I kind of detail some conclusions about him here at the end. Was he a man of the people? And why was he so popular? Just some things to think about. All right, well, next week we will have the midterm essay due, so we will probably not have a video lecture, but if I deem it necessary, we'll throw it out there. Have a good week.